Welcome to our board table disruption conflicts of interest discussion. I am Martha Rams. I'm the legal director of the Pacific Legal Education and Outreach Society. We have launched a poll, so you can tell us who you are. Very helpful to us to know who's in the room. I learned about a new platform yesterday called Menti that does graphic data visualization or graphic visualization of who's in rooms and such. Maybe when we start again in the new year, we can look into doing that because it looks cool, if nothing else. So today I am coming to you from the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish. And we thank them for their forbearance of our presence on their land. I'd like one day to think that we might all not have to say unceded, and in the sense that we conclude the agreements and treaties that have been in negotiation for decades here on Turtle Island. And also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are in the middle of a climate cataclysm over here. And to those of you who are in the particularly affected areas, and no doubt watching the rain coming down today with some trepidation, you know, a lot of us are out here trying to help to support the needs of our communities. And I want everyone out there who's been affected to know that we are also looking at ways that we can support particularly arts venues and venues generally that may now be facing another round of closures or cancellations or modifications of schedules. So I would invite you also, and Jocelyn will put into the chat a link to the Arts Reentry Legal Clinic, which is a short-term pilot clinic where we're making available summary legal advice from a special lawyer on the issues that arts organizations are facing as a consequence of the return to our regularly scheduled activities, you might say. Unfortunately, the funding's limited to arts and culture and heritage, but please do reach out if you run a venue or are part of a venue that's been affected, because we'd like to at least hear from you to start thinking about how we can help. So today we're going to have a conversation with two people, Kyla Epstein and Guy Chartier. Both of them are going to introduce themselves. We're going to talk today about conflicts of interest. And before I turn the proverbial mic over to Kyla, I'll just situate us for a couple of minutes. So as some of you probably are sick of hearing me say, I'm a lawyer in private practice as well as the legal director of PLEO, and I've been working with the sector for a goodly number of decades now. 3, in fact, I think. Inching my way to 4. And over those years, I think that one of the areas that probably everybody at one time or another has confronted is just what exactly is a conflict of interest anyway, and a lot of fear and trepidation around conflicts of interest and whether or not, and accusations of conflicts of interest and how they impact folks. I attended an AGM in a rural area of the province, in part because there was a there was a lot of tension in the community, and at the AGM, one of the directors was accused of being in a conflict of interest. He didn't take kindly to the accusation. It was said very aggressively, and he turned completely red, which just to indicate the impact that it had on him. He was very angry at being accused, as he said, of doing something illegal. He was an individual who provided, as his business, ATMs to various venues, and he was really the only provider of said ATMs in that region. And yes, he was in a conflict. However, when the board addressed it, as they had done weeks earlier, he recused himself. He was not in the room when the conflict was discussed, and the board waived the conflict and made the decision to enter into the contract with his company. It saved them a lot of money, and it was a decision that they made exactly in the way that is set out in the Societies Act. And so they had done nothing wrong. But the perception of the way it was handled was also done correctly, but the surrounding environment was just really tense. And I think that continues to be an ongoing issue. And I'm sure there are people on today's webinar that have also struggled with what does any of this mean for us. And so we have been talking about this also in light of the amended Societies Act, which only certain provisions have been given royal assent. Most of the provisions in the amendments will not be enforced until the regulations through an order in council are published. And I don't right at this moment know when that is. One of the changes, though, to alert everyone to, is that when requested by a director, an individual who may be in a conflict of interest may remain in the meeting in order to speak and share their perspective prior to them leaving the room, recusing themselves and not voting as would be improper. And my guess is that this clarification is largely a consequence of people being confused by how to handle this, and that in many cases it is permissible, in fact desirable, to have the individual speak directly to the situation. For example, if Guy's sister were to offer to create a new website for the Division of Family Practice, and it was free as opposed to a $500 fee that they might otherwise have to pay. That's if they're lucky these days. Anyway, so without further ado, I will pass the mic to Kyla to introduce herself, and we'll get this party started.
Thank you, Martha. Hi, everyone. My name is Kyla. My pronouns are she, her. And just for purposes of accessibility, I am a white person with long, dark brown hair. I'm wearing glasses and have a green shawl wrapped around me because it's freezing in my apartment right now, and a big bookcase behind me and a painting by the talented Nikki Kanamui behind me. As I said, my name is Kyla. I live and work on the unceded and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and this is where I am raising my kid and figuring out what it means to be a good guest here as well. In terms of today and what I'm here to offer today, what you need to know about me is that I have a cell phone next to me in case said kid needs anything, but otherwise I will be ignoring it. I also have a monitor over to my right, which I'll be looking at in terms of notes, so I'm not ignoring what's happening, but you might see me glance away. The website situated me as a governance expert, but I would say I'm more an expert in being curious, not an expert in anything. Martha said this is an area that folks have often struggled with, and that would be true of me. I have struggled around what is proper or improper in a conflict of interest, why we even, the way that we even define interest and what we think about in terms of interest beyond some sort of a clear material gain, some questions around that. So I'm really here just because I like thinking out loud about these things, and I'm really excited to talk to you and Martha and all of you about it. So thanks for joining.
Okay, thank you so much, Kyla. Martha, I'm just going to step in here. So thank you all for joining today. Really good to see you all. As Martha said, my name is Guy Chartier, and I'm the Executive Director of the Powell River Division of Family Practice, and also I am the Board Chair of First Credit Union, which is a cooperative financial institution with $800 million in assets located on Sunshine Coast and also on Vancouver Island. I am here located in Powell River, who is on the traditional and treaty land, which is very unique to our Tla'amin nation here. And actually my house where I am currently is the traditional village, originally called Tsleil-Waututh. So from that perspective, we just had an announcement a few weeks ago that the paper mill who opened over 100 years ago in our community, which displays the traditional village, actually made part of their reconciliation process, made a name change to their organization to recognize the traditional village. So I have to say, living here and sensing the emotions that were at that ceremony were quite unique and special. And I feel very privileged to be part of this for me and my family. So at this point, I would like to do some just opening remark, and then I'm going to launch right into two quite concrete examples of some conflict of interest that I've experienced myself in an organization, and hopefully that's going to trigger some good discussions and questions with the group today. So the first remark that I would like to share is I believe there's like two dimensions to conflict of interest. One is, I would say, it's on the Martha side, which is the legal side. But the other part, which probably most of you are gonna experience more, is on the ethical side. And ethics has to do with trust. And with trust comes my and your social currency and social license to be able to do what you do with your organization. And if you lose trust, then you can't deliver on your mission. So that's why I believe that conflict of interest and this idea of trust is really, really critical to any organizations. And the other piece that Martha actually touched base a little bit in her intro is how do we approach this concept of conflict of interest? And I would like to somewhat challenge a little bit of the status quo today, because I think often what we do is we look at it from a risk and deficit perspective. And I would like us to think of any conflict of interest from opportunity and abundance perspective. And that's some of the insights I would like to offer to you today. So let's dive into some concrete examples. And they're related to the current organization that I work with. For just to put into the context, so we have currently in British Columbia 35 what we call divisions of family practice, and they're funded by the government in partnership with the provincial government, the Doctors Association, so Doctors of BC. And what they do is they provide a mechanism to support family physicians in community to be able to deliver on healthcare common goals, mainly with partners in community. So most of the divisions were set up 12 years ago. We went from 3, as I said, up to 35 now. And here's the first example I would like to share with you. And it's around representation. So while I cannot see all of you guys, I would like to kind of let you raise your hand if on your board or your organizations you have seats, that are what we call for representation, that a seat is allocated to a specific person or interest group on your board. And this is how we kind of started. So if you imagine when we set up our society, we had in our small community multiple clinics. So our thinking at the beginning, hey, let's think about broad representation. So let's think about bringing representatives from each clinic to our board. And that is a very interesting concept because if you think about it, you bring a person that will have a unique interest or perspective coming to the board and have that representation that might at some point, based on what you have on the table and decisions that have to be made, might come into conflict with actually the greater good of the organization. So this is something that we experienced a few years ago when we started. So, one of the questions Martha wanted us to discuss is then how do you manage this, right? And for us, again, coming from an opportunity and abundance perspective, like we're saying, what can we do better here and how can we address this? And I think the first one is, education and policy. So having conversations at the board table. But from a policy perspective, what's really interesting is we went back down, and I don't know if any of you like to do policy development, but let's not underestimate the power of words in a policy. And really, when we look at the policy that we had for recruiting and our board structure, we changed one simple word from looking at representation to looking for diversity. And just in that simple exercise, being very clear that when we bring people to the table, what we're looking at is not a representation for a special interest or let's say a clinic or a community, but was actually bringing diversity to the table, knowing that the goal is to make the best decisions for the organization. So this is something that, that we encounter at the beginning of our journey. And again, from all of your organizations, to think about, is there any of those seats that are for representation and how do we accommodate, if that is the case, this situation from a conflict of interest perspective. The other example I would like to share with you is around some of the changes that happened, if those of you were around back in 2016, around the Societies Act, and that was around directors' compensation. So in 2016, with full implementation up to 2018, there was a few changes, but one of the major one was around the section 41 around directors' compensation. And basically, what this specific section was saying is that you cannot have, and I'm just looking here, the majority of directors must not receive remuneration under contract for services. And really the underlying principle is around conflict of interest. Well, that was somewhat bad news for all of us across the province because we were set up in a way that our directors were compensated for their work, which is still under the new act, absolutely appropriate for directors' work. However, when it comes to contract for services with the organization, this then was meant that all of our directors was actually in a conflict of interest because that was actually in the new section 41 not allowed. So what do we do? And actually this was, I believe, a really interesting social experiment because we were 35 legal entities that were all in the same position. So then what happened? Actually, there was many, like 3 reactions to that, or 3 different directions or roads that the divisions of family practice took. the first one, some decided, let's stay as a society, let's just revise how we do our honorarium. Let's make sure that the other directors that are there don't receive any contract for services. So either retired physicians or other people that are not affected by this specific rule. Others were actually went totally another route, which is we're going to change our legal entity and become a cooperative, which has different requirements and rules. And we actually took the third road, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And that was diversification. So really, when we look at the rules that we cannot have the majority of our directors on the contract for services, so how can we look at that from an opportunity perspective? And actually, that was a perfect timing for us because we were challenged mainly about two things. The first one was sustainability. And I don't know for you in terms of your organization, sustaining and bringing, people that are interested in dedicated time to sit on boards, it's often a challenge, especially if it's volunteer work. So how do we actually sustain over time to have only physicians that are come to our board and keep that energy and sustainability? And the second one was just the recognition that good governance practice shows that diversity of thoughts, of experience, of background makes better decision. And we realized that there was some kind of a limitation on that side. So our solution was actually from a lens of opportunity is we now have a board of 7 directors, and the minority is actually 3 of our members, and the majority, 4, are actually what we call public directors or community members. So what that does is actually not only solve the issue of conflict of interest from the New Societies Act, but also provides sustainability in terms of governance, provides a structure with more diversity for better decision making. And the last one, I think that is worth mentioning, it's actually helped us better apply our strategy, because now what we have is people that are on our board that can tell our own story in the community. So I'm sharing that story, and especially the second example, because it reinforces this idea that when we look at conflict of interest, obviously, we have to look from a risk-based perspective, but also to always look at it from an opportunity so that you can make your organization stronger, better, and in order to deliver on your mission for your members and the community. So I'm just going to stop here. And Martha, I'll just open it to you for some comments.
Sure. I also would love Kyla to weigh in. I do have one question though, which is, why is a doctor potentially in a conflict of interest? Can you, I know what Section 41 relates to, but could you explain that how physicians are compensated for their activities on boards of directors?
Absolutely. So this is so under what we call the Physician Master Agreement, which is the rules that are set up between the Doctor Association and our provincial government. There's a recognition for the time that physicians spend outside of their clinical hours in order to support system change in our healthcare. So based on that, we have some rules in terms of like what we call sessional payment, where basically there's engagement of physicians. And on top of that, there is some what we call incentives that are actually agreed upon by the ministry, that we then divisions become the conduit for paying those incentives. So from that perspective, those payment of incentives for services, let's say your doctor is on call for seeing patients at a hospital, there is incentives for that, and we are the conduit, the legal entity that will make those payments. That is a contract for services. So a physician that sits on our board, that is out of their clinical work, that get compensated for board work, absolutely fine, but then also receive an incentive that is agreed upon by the ministry in order to deliver that service, to be on call, and then that creates this conflict of interest.
Thanks, Guy. I think for some of the people in the room, they may not know that actually this is a reality for not just divisions of family practice, but all the societies that bring together doctors across BC. And the good news is that subject to the regulations coming out, Section 41 will allow, the regulations will set out that groups of societies will be exempt from that very provision. So for those divisions of family practices that incorporated as co-ops or went to that length, they might want to return to the fold, or perhaps they'll just stay the way they are in any event. So Kyla.
Yeah, it's obviously, and Guy and I talked before this, and as I'm sure I have more questions than thoughts at this point, but one of the things that really strikes me about this case study that Guy has shared with us is this piece around opportunity and what is the response. And something that we've been talking quite a bit in a peer network group that I'm a part of around reimagining governance is this question around whether or not the organization even should be a nonprofit. And I think that's a really great place to start, because again, you're subject to these things under the Societies Act. And I do think whether or not, wherever you end up on the answer, an opportunity around, like a conflict of interest or a perceived conflict of interest, is an opportunity to ask whether your model is the right one. And I really love that you folks did that. And I think that's a really great place to start. And then I'm interested in this idea about having resulted, what you've done is you've basically changed your board composition. You've looked at your board composition, and something you said, and I'm not sure if you meant this, was you said something about these public appointees now on the board can advocate for the organization out in the community. And when we think about what a board does, one of the big roles is, of course, advocating for the organization. And that is actually something that is, I think, another way in which we get into this ethical, non-legal piece around conflict of interest. I've been on some boards before where it has been a question of whether or not the sitting board members are the right people to advocate, or whether or not former board members are the better people to do that because they've now left the organization. And again, this isn't about the legal conflict of interest they might have, but again, there's this concept of who is in the best position. And then it gets into this question of whether staff as well are in a good position to do that. So I really like that gain that you made that perhaps wasn't there before. One of the pieces that I've been thinking about in preparing for this is, because we are not yet, I think Martha set the tone, we're not just talking about actual material gain, legal of interest in the legal realm, but is this question around what do we mean by interest, and what is in our interests as directors? Because I'll just use this as an example. I sat on the board of a public library, and one of the decisions that we had to make while I was on the board was around where we would redirect some funding, some resources in terms of when branches should be open and what that might mean for impacts for closing other branches. And the reality is that all of us on the board, because of the requirements under the Library Act, live in the library system area, and we use the library because we're big library fans. And so it now, reflecting on preparing for today, I thought, well, none of us declared a conflict of interest in terms of whether or not our branches would be open longer or closed so that other branches could be open longer. And this is a really interesting thought for me around, so is the conflict of interest diluted and less important when the gain and the benefit is a collective one? Because the branch wouldn't just be open for me on Sundays. It's not, as much as I would love my own personal library branch, that's not what was on the table. The table was this question around a collective gain or a collective improvement of interest. So I'm curious, Martha and Guy, I don't know if you have thoughts to say, but in that moral, ethical space around whether or not we can think about, well, is the gain personal or is it collective? And what does that do to perception and reputation?
Unmute myself. Thanks for framing it that way, Kyla, because I think that we often get caught up in, in the example I gave, this was illegal. Well, Yeah, technically it was a violation of the Societies Act if they hadn't disclosed the conflict and then continued to be involved in decision making around the contract that they were the beneficiaries of, right? But it is, you know, the thing, there's a couple of points. One, the director owes a duty of loyalty to the society. And in that they have to act in the best interests of the society, not in their own interests. And so a personal interest like the contract for the ATM is something that's going to materially benefit an individual, or theoretically, you know, being there if the decision is for that person to be the representative, given a seat at the table of an umbrella organization, for example. So let's say you're the Horse Council of BC and you want to become a director, and there's only so many seats, and there's a whole process to do that. Then there may be, but you have to do something in your own organization in order to become that person who's appointed to the board. You will have to always act in the interests of the society, not in your own interests. And who knows why that person wants to be on the Horse Council board, but maybe because they think that small stables are not getting their fair share of the attention of the board, for example, or, you know, gymnastics BC or swimming BC, you know, any of these larger organizations that are made up, their boards are made up of representatives. So it doesn't have to be just a material benefit. And it is really about perception. And the point, though, about the duty of loyalty and the obligations to act in the best interest is that you ask yourself, in a way, you know, what are my interests here, and do I have any, and should I disclose them? And the default is, particularly in a personal one, yes, definitely with the material interests like the ATM, and when in doubt, disclose, because it really is nothing to be afraid of. You know, you're a director at a board meeting. The issue is put on the agenda. The member of the board who's involved, well, arguably today would have to leave the room, but you know, that doesn't always happen. Rob Ford ended up in the Court of Appeal arguing that he didn't have to leave the room. And the court said, well, actually you did, because you carry a lot of influence. It wasn't so much the money, because it was about the donation of funds to a football club. It was that Mr. Ford was standing there, as you can imagine, Mr. Ford standing. I don't quite have the heft, but you can just imagine him, you know, doing his or whatever it was face, and wait, you know, even, or the Donald Trump leaning over Hillary Clinton in the debates, this intimidation of folks. So it is a really important principle that they leave the room and that they allow the decision to be made, and that the board also understand that it can waive the conflict, not waive, but waive the conflict. And they will have good reason to do that in most cases. And there's really nothing to fear from that. It's about transparency and accountability. And once you get your head around that and maybe get out of the, oh my God, it's illegal, or the accusational tone, and just unpack it a bit, you'll realize, sitting around the table, I hope, that it's an opportunity to get to know each other, and really to learn from one another, to borrow from Guy's opportunity language.
Yeah, thank you, Martha. And I just want to add, I think on the point of perception, and that is so important, because my own experience is that perception is reality. So, you know, when we are faced with those, you know, perceived conflict of interest, is how do we, you know, as, you know, senior management or directors, like, how do we proactively think about mitigation? And I think that's a really key aspect, and not thinking only in the terms of real conflict of interest, because perception, as you probably know and experience, can go really far and can be very damaging. And while it's, you know, it's not unethical or it's not illegal, if it's perceived as, it can definitely be detrimental to the organization.
Yeah, I have two things I want to jump on here. One is perception is reality, but perception is also biased and is full of a lot of biases. And there are times when I think it does, I can't think of a great example right now, when I do think an organization may want to take the risk, or whatever we want to call it, where there isn't a legal conflict of interest, but it's just a perceived conflict of interest, to push back on that perception in the community, because our perceptions, like everything else, are full of our systemic biases. And so it may seem to the outside, well, you know, this person is too close to the decision, this person, you know, used to, whatever the example might be. Well, I'll use my own example, so I'm not talking to anyone else's story. I'm a union member, I'm a member of CUPE. And when I sat on the library board, it's represented by CUPE workers, and I'm not in the same local. I don't have any say on what happens in that local. And so I recused myself for 8 years out of a perception. And, you know, again, when I reflect on that, I think, but what I do bring is the perception of worker lenses to that. And so we may, or someone else may in the future, I won't be on the board again, but someone else in the future might want to say, actually, it's time for us to say, it's really important to have people who have a unionized perspective on an employer that is overseeing unionized employees. Naturally, again, if they were in the same union, that would be different, but from a different local or from a different union, maybe, and again, I'm not criticizing myself or others involved in that decision for me to step aside out of an abundance of caution. But I think it's a really good question to ask ourselves, is when do we want to go with that perception, and when do we want to push back on it?
The bigger issue in the scenario that you described, Kyla, is that you might take information you learn about negotiations with the other local to your local, and thus up the chain of command.
But then I would be breaking another obligation. Like I'm already bound by closed meetings anyway. So not only would I be acting in a dual interest, but I'd actually be violating my obligations to the board, which I could do on something else that I have no interest in as well.
And I think the point is that you need a conflict of interest policy to guide people. You need to do that at the beginning of every year, you know, when you have new board members, ideally the first meeting after the AGM. And then, yeah, you would recuse yourself from conversations that have anything to do with bargaining and remuneration of staff. At the same time, I mean, that's partly why we didn't get a complete ban on workers as directors. It was precisely to enable people who work for a society to have a role in informing the work. The tension that will arise inevitably is where your own interest as a person who works for the society and the best interests of the society may diverge. And that's, you know, that's something that comes up or doesn't come up at all, you know. And in the case of the doctors, I just want to shift us a little to the Q&A. Heidi did have a question about board members receiving compensation. It's because doctors get compensated for their time on boards that even though that compensation isn't I mean, I guess it is coming from is it coming from the Division of Family Practice, or does it come through another door, actually, Guy?
Yeah, so it's actually coming under, as I said, the partnership between like the Doctors of BC and the provincial government, and we receive funding, and this is a way to to compensate the physicians for their time based on the agreement that was set with the government.
Right, but does the money come through the Division of Family Practice?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah,
Yes.
okay, so you're getting the money to give to them. Yeah, so effectively they are compensated. And that was the problem is, you know, they now have, under Section 41, they would be, they'd have a board, because originally when they were set up, they had this, you know, only physicians can be directors problem, probably, and that put them in direct conflict with Section 41, which is, as I said, being changed to, well, and my guess would be that the divisions of family practice may well be exempt, as other physicians societies likely will be, because the physicians engagement societies, there's a whole, there's another 36 of those. They are all mandated to have physicians as directors.
Yeah, and Martha, just to add to this, another piece also that was added to the new Societies Act is disclosure. So I think that's important to mention. So if you have directors, senior manager that receive compensation up to a certain threshold, then you have to disclose within your annual financial statements. So that's another way, you know, when you talk about before disclosure, so this is one that is formalized and again, being transparent as to this is how people are compensated.
Right. Yeah. So what Guy is referring to there is that there's an amendment to the Societies Act that will require societies to disclose those under a conflict contract of services above the amount set by regulation, which is 75,000. The change is that you can, it's not just the top 10, it's everybody. So as long as it's over the 75,000. And there is a requirement to disclose the amount of remuneration given to your director. First, that they are remunerated, that needs to be in your bylaws, and the amount of that remuneration once if it reaches that threshold, which it may not in the case of, does it? Guy, have you ever seen it go over? I mean, would yours go over 75? I guess if all 7 of you were doctors, it might.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it's individual, but the reporting actually can be combined. That's how.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Something I wanted to pick up on, Martha, you mentioned at some point, my notes are getting messy here, but you know, as directors, and the title of today's event, or the subtitle was, you know, does your board know how to identify, avoid, and navigate? And I think what's really important there is you've already mentioned policy and the importance of policy and looking at the policy, but I also think when I think back to myself as the first time I was on a board in my 20s, and this could be all kinds of reasons. You could be young and on a first board, or all kinds of reasons why you might not have been on boards before, or why policy language, even as much as we try to make it clear and accessible, isn't. I think there's also another set of tools, and this might not need to be said, it might be obvious, but you said at one point also, ask yourself. So I think providing board members and directors with a set of questions to ask themselves when they're deliberating on decisions or where something's in front of them can be as useful and perhaps even more useful on the ground than a policy. Policy is needed and required and things like that. But I also think that in terms of onboarding and supporting board members, we're often and I'm so, you know, I do this too. I'm like, oh, but look at the policy, look at the policy. And that's just not what happens. So even something like on agendas, having a set of 3 questions that you might want to ask yourself about every decision that you're deliberating on. And I think that that can be a really useful tool for having people navigate the realities of this. Is it conflict? Is it not as well? And then I have a question about the society changes I want to remember to ask, but go ahead.
So you're suggesting something like a checklist. Have you seen a checklist?
Well, it's interesting. I've only ever seen this in terms of other questions. For example, I know an organization that is committed to decolonization has a set of questions that must be asked at every time a decision is being made. So the lens that must be applied to a decision. And I know that also this group of us that's working to sort of reimagine governance, we've started to build a decision-making model. So around decisions and what informs a decision. And I think that conflicts of interest come up in places where decisions are going to be made. So revisiting your decision-making model and whatever questions you use or parameters or criteria that you use in decision-making, that's the place to put in and to catch and surface. And like you said, disclose, because again, it's not necessarily a problem that there's a conflict of interest. It's a problem that it isn't disclosed or that someone doesn't recuse themselves. So I think building that into your decision-making model hopefully will make it flow in use a little easier than a policy that's saved somewhere.
Yeah, I think, the obvious question is, do I personally benefit in some way from the decision that is being made? I haven't seen a checklist, but I'd invite anyone participating to pop it over to us, because I'm very curious to see what it would look like, because we could easily add it to our little practical guide to the Societies Act, which I've been working on for 2 years. One day it'll come out. And I like checklists as a functional tool.
I have a question I wanted to ask you about the changes coming up, and Guy, I'd be curious what you think in terms of how this might roll out now that you've made the change to your board composition. There's this, I'm just looking at here, so directors can stay in the room to provide information. This is the change we're getting. And it says a single director can ask the conflicted person to stay unless the bylaws provide. And so for organizations who are going to have to think through this and think whether or not they're going to add this to make a change to their bylaws, I'm curious about that single person, because exercising power and influence can happen with a single person. And so let's say one doctor asks another doctor to stay in the room, but the other folks were like, we don't want this person to stay in the room and provide this information. We think this is going to create a power dynamic where I'm just using your example, Guy, for your organization, not picking on doctors, but that they may be able to provide information, for example, that might not be understood by members of the public or things like that, because information is one way that we exercise power in groups. So I'm curious about thinking about how to build this into our bylaws that might also address the power of a single person getting to change the circumstances.
No, thank you, Kyla. That's obviously a very interesting question. So just practically, and that's been our experience so far. So Martha, you talked about policies as a foundation. So you turn policies into procedures. So what does that mean practically? Once you have this policies in place, so on our side, what we have, and it's actually the same at the credit union that I sit on, is then there's a full declaration based on the policy, in terms of formal declaration, signed paper. So we have the same with our society. Then it comes to board meetings. And at those meetings, the second agenda item is always declaration of conflict of interest. And from that perspective, Kyla, what I'm getting as a cue is actually, should that be turned then into a few questions that would really make it, people think more than just, having this statement there that often, to be honest, probably 99.9%, there's nothing is declared. But what it is, because we've had that before, is actually there is a decision at some point, is the person staying in the room? And absolutely, this is obviously an interesting dynamic for those of you who have been there when somebody declared, and then, for an example that I could think of, is there was a consensus that a person could stay in the room, right? So it's recorded in the minutes, but it's obviously an interesting dynamic. So that's probably the open question is, what is the best way, especially for the board chair, when this situation is presented, how do you best accommodate or facilitate the conversation so that there's no power or influence really at play, and that decisions can be done in the best interest of the organization?
In that kind of situation, you need a very confident and chair, somebody who can, and collective, actually. I mean, consensus decision-making is never easy, actually. People think of it as easy, but when you actually sit down and think about how are you going to deal with that one person who's holding out? Because ultimately, most of us don't have in our bylaws provisions that allow for less than basically 100% unanimity and consensus. So, and that's what it means. Consensus means 100%, not 75, not 2/3. It means 100. So that can be very challenging, where you have somebody who has a very different worldview from your own. And I think the reality, listening to you, Kyla, also is that if you want to avoid this entirely, you're going to have to put something in your bylaws that make it clear what you will do, and that only in circumstances where there's consensus is the individual going to be permitted, because the provision does allow bylaws to set this out. And the more that you unpack the amendments to the Societies Act, and if you actually read the Societies Act provisions carefully around the management of a society, you realize that there's a lot of areas that are left out in the model bylaws, particularly, and those are the bylaws that most organizations, whether it's this old Schedule B bylaws that were attached to the old Society Act, or the new model bylaws attached to the not so new Act, Societies Act, there's a lot of open questions there. And so, and certainly where you are invested in consensus, and you point out something I hadn't thought of, which is the one person can actually shift a whole range of issues. I mean, this was the Rob Ford problem, right? Is that from his perspective, since it was his money, ultimately it was his donation, like why shouldn't he be there? And it was Rob Ford, so there was really no opportunity to debate. I mean, they went to the Court of Appeal of Ontario over this, which, when you think about it, over the amount of money, the tens of thousands of dollars spent in lawyers' fees and court time alone, it's absurd how much was spent just to, he could have taken that money and given it to the bloody football club, like how. I find it a very frustrating read, because a lot about Mr. Ford was frustrating to some of us. In any event, I shan't digress too much. There is one thing that I do want to point out, and you raised this in your Q&A there, Heidi. First of all, if you're a registered charity, you cannot remunerate your directors for being directors, period. And there is an absolute period at the end of that sentence. It does not matter who those directors are. If you are a registered charity, a director cannot personally benefit from any charitable dollars. So sure, you could get them a gift card every year to Eaton's, to the Bay, which does still exist, or Nordstrom, I guess. But you cannot give them $100 for showing up at a meeting each and every month. I had a client who was in sports, and their directors were all referees. And so they thought they got around the problem until they told me what they were doing. And they just gave because they were referees getting paid for games, they just gave them money for coming to meetings too. And that was a little bit of a problem. But they were not a registered charity. So they had to figure out how to distinguish between paying the directors as directors and paying the directors for providing a service. You can pay your referees and they can be on the board. But if every director is a referee, then that's a problem under Section 41. We'll see if any sporting groups are exempt. Actually, that's an interesting question. I think, you know, the reality is for groups like Heidi's, which I think is a registered charity, but I could be wrong, is you're going to have to think long and hard about how people with diverse socioeconomic barriers to participation are enabled to participate, and the amount and it goes to the risk tolerance of your board. And I don't want to overstate this, but let me just say, if you know, there's 30,000 nonprofits in the province of BC now. I don't know the number of charities, but there's quite a few. There's at least 83,000 in Canada. It's probably a slightly bigger number now, but enough keep getting tossed that I don't know, might balance out. There's not a great deal of oversight and enforcement. So who is paying attention? Who's likely to notice either that your financial statements aren't disclosing, your bylaws don't make it, don't state that somebody can be remunerated for to be a director. They may in fact state the opposite, or they could be silent. It does beg the question, you know, given the what I will call an enforcement vacuum, who's going to know? The issue that's going to come up, though, is really going to be, if it does get noticed, then it's a problem. And you know, it will be interesting to see if, for example, an Indigenous serving organization were to argue that the people who are on the boards of those societies are entitled to be paid irrespective of what the charities directorate might say about it. It will be interesting to see how that kind of argument might play out. I think that, you know, as we're seeing, you know, funders are more interested now in supporting organizations that have historically been shut out. They are also joining in the call to change the Income Tax Act around direction and control. We did a webinar with Senator Ratna Omadvar on that. For people who are interested, you know, I think that as the calls for changes grow, and I encourage all of you on this webinar to check out what is happening in the House of Commons as we move forward, in case hopefully S222 is tabled ideally in the House of Commons to change the direction and control issues, to allow more charitable funds to go to non-charities, particularly Indigenous and other groups that have experienced historical and current marginalizations. I think we're in a period of change, and so I hope that we'll see that change. Kyla, you
yeah, I just noticed the time, and I want to squeeze this in before and then pass it to Guy. But I think the important thing about, and I'm not a charities expert by any means, but the important thing about the charity thing is also to recognize that the root my perception of one of the roots of not paying directors of charities is where charities come from, which is a philanthropic model of wealthy people creating charities to do good in the world. And so their directors didn't need to be paid. And as we're thinking more and more about who should be close to decision-making power, and it's, in my perspective, not those folks, but then having those folks use their volunteer and luxury time for this work is, I think, both unreasonable and unethical. And so going back to the origins of the legislation and questioning even what's set up as a conflict, I think is really important.
Guy?
Yeah, just a final comment. I'm just looking at Bruce's question there, that may be still unanswered, but so important that I also raise is this idea of representation. So when you have somebody that is representing an organization, what does it look like when they sit on those boards? So probably phase 2 of this conversation, Martha, but thank you.
Yeah, and we started these lunch and learn webinars primarily as a way to talk about issues affecting the nonprofit sector as a consequence of the pandemic, and we've been continuing them this year, and we'll continue to do them next year, primarily to really unpack some of this stuff. And from PLEO's perspective, just to remind everybody that, we're a small little group. We finally seem to have a little bit of dough, and I'm really interested to know what resources you think you need. Because whether it's helping with a checklist, putting together another workshop, maybe we need a workshop on conflict of interest. It is one of the, I have done it. So we could be looking at doing some more of that. And then these conversations, which I think, the best way to learn stuff is not by being in a panic and freaking out, but by having an honest conversation amongst yourselves about what's going on, and then asking for help if you need it. And creating, and those strong peer-based learning setups that you all are a part of, I hope, are critical to the success of all of the nonprofit sector. So with that, it is 1:02, and I'm sure people need to get back to work to the extent that this isn't work. Thanks so much for giving your time today, Guy and Kyla, and everybody for coming. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. This is such a meaty topic and it's hard to answer many of your questions without spending another hour. But we definitely keep track of them. And, if you have a particular issue that you think you'd like to talk about and want to do a webinar yourselves, let us know, because we'd happily spotlight you and make you talk. Anyway, goodbye, everybody, and have a great rest of the day, and may the rains be light.